video, I'm going to introduce how to knit with double pointed needles. And you want to use this method if you are knitting something very small in the round that's too small to do with a regular circular needle. Although another method to use instead of double pointed needles is magic loop, which I can show you in another video. To get started, I cast on all of my stitches onto just one needle plus one. So I need 16 stitches for this little sample I'm going to do, so I have cast on 17. The next thing I'm going to do is to distribute them across my needles. I like to work with 5 needles, so your work goes on 4 needles and then you're using one to knit, which I'll show you in a moment. So we're going to slip 4 stitches onto each of these needles. So here's my first 4. I move them to the middle and then I just let go of them. I like these bamboo needles because they're a little bit grippier, so the needle doesn't just fall out of the stitches, which I find can happen with metal needles. These happen to be by U-Knit, U-N-I-T-T. We're just going to keep going 4 on each of the next 2 needles. There we go. Okay, so now I have 4 stitches on each of 3 needles and 5 stitches on the needle that is attached to my working yarn. The first important thing to do is to make sure your stitches are not twisted around on the needles. You don't have them, twisted backwards and have kind of a kink in your work, because that will be a problem for later. So they're all straight and tidy, and the bottom part of the stitch is into the center like that. Okay. So now to connect these in a circle, I'm going to take the 2 loose ends and move them to the tips, and the needle with my working yarn is on the right. I'm going to slip the last stitch, the one that my working yarn is attached to. I'm going to slip it back to my left hand needle. And then I'm going to take the second stitch on the left hand needle and pull it up and over that stitch I just slipped. Okay. And that creates a very effective and tidy join. It's hard to see with my working yarn in the way and my little tail end, but you get a very nice clean join then. And because I dropped off my extra stitch, I now have exactly 16 stitches ready to knit. So the stitch on the right, I'm going to move back to the middle, the stitches to the middle of the needle, and just let it go. The stitch with the working yarn attached to it is now going to be my first stitch. Normally your working yarn would be the needle on the right, but for this first stitch, because we slipped it over, it's attached on the left. And now you just take your 5th needle, your empty needle, and you reach in, and this is the one you're going to actually knit with. So you just knit like usual across all of those stitches on the needle that you're working. Oops, I split that stitch. Okay, here at the end, you've now emptied all the stitches off. This was the needle that had my stitches on it, and it's now empty. So it goes into my right hand. It becomes my right hand working needle. And here are all the rest of my stitches. And now I'm ready for the next needle. Okay, so these are the stitches I just worked on this right needle. I'm now ready for the stitches on this left needle. I always take the needle that is on my right with the working yarn. It goes underneath the needle on the left with my new stitches, and my new needle comes up over the top. I just find that to be the handiest way to keep it all together. And you can just keep knitting like this all the way around your project. And every time you get to the end, you scooch those stitches from the right needle into the middle, remove the needle that was on the left, and get set up for the next one. So again, here I am. The stitches are on the needle on the right with the working yarn. Here's my next set of stitches, which I've now picked up to be in my left hand. This finger is kind of just coming in through the middle of the project. My left hand needle is on top of my right hand needle, and I am reaching in right on top again with my clean needle, my empty needle, to do my first knit stitch. I'm going to show you one more time, and then we're going to talk about one more tip. Okay, so those are the stitches I just worked. I just moved them to the middle. I now have an empty needle, which is the one I had just moved the stitches off of, and that will become the one I knit next. So the one on the right is the one with my working yarn. The one on the left, those are the stitches I'm about to work. My empty needle comes up on top, and I continue to knit across. One challenge people have with knitting with double pointed needles is that transition between the needles. Sometimes the tension doesn't stay even, which can create a little bit of a ladder effect. Pull that tail yarn down in the middle so you can see more easily. So let's take a look at what that laddering is, and then I'll give you a couple of solutions for how to fix it. So this is laddering. When you start to get this gap in between the needles because you didn't have an even tension. Usually it happens because the stitches aren't tight enough, but actually can happen if some of your stitches are too tight as well. So there are a couple of ways to clean that up. One way is just to be aware of it and to think about keeping an even tension kind of around the corner between the two needles. Another idea though is that, remember on the last few needles, after I finished the right needle, I went ahead and moved to the left needle, knitting with my clean needle in my right hand. One thing you can do instead is just sit that needle down for one stitch, and I can knit one stitch from the left onto the right. So now that stitch has 5. They used to each have 4 all the way around, but now I've got 5 here and 3 here. Now I'll pick up my empty needle and I will continue across the row. What this does is, in case you happen to have a little bit of a loose stitch on one row, it doesn't keep perpetuating the problem. So now I'm going to do it again. So I put down my empty needle and I'm going to do one stitch with the needle that was already in my right hand, but now with the new needle in my left hand that had the stitches ready to be worked. So I do 1, I'm back to 4, and now I pick up my empty needle. The other way you can do that is you can go ahead and knit. If you want to keep the same number of stitches all the way across, you can put the needle down like I did. You can do a couple of stitches. I'm going to do here. But then you can actually scoot them back on to the empty needle if you want, if there's a reason that you want to keep it lined up in a certain way. I don't like to do that because then you see I had to put down my yarn from my left hand, unwrap it from my hand, and get completely all set back up again. So I don't usually do it that way. I do often do the version I just showed you where you simply knit an extra stitch. Now I appreciate that this looks a little crazy. You know, there's stuff going on all over the place here. But really, once you get the hang of it, and once you just have faith that your stitches will stay on the double pointed needles when you let go of them, then you just continue working and you end up with a really nice, small tube for whatever project you're doing. So that's really all there is to knitting on double pointed needles. I hope that helps.